wanting to share that with other people, because I don't actually think that it was ever intended just for a small group of people who sort of did it professionally, as monks, right? I think that there's a call to us from the divine to enter into God's holiness, God's peace, God's healing and love. And I think this is the best route in. So that's so I'm telling you what I think right up front. I am a Benedictine monk. My monastery is Incarnation Monastery in Omaha, Nebraska. Our wider community is called the Benedictine Way. And that's because what we're trying to do is teach and live and demonstrate, witness to the particular approach to living a life of following Jesus as a Benedictine. And what that means is that there's a great deal of prayer that's involved with that. And much of that prayer is very formal. We go to the chapel 5 times a day, and we pray all the offices and do those sorts of things, have the Eucharist each day. But our particular community has a strong emphasis on the contemplative side of that prayer. And I'll go in and explain what that means in a minute. And one of the things about me that's different from most Benedictines is that I'm an Episcopalian, and our community comes out of the Episcopal Diocese of Nebraska. It is something that lots of people don't know even exists, but in fact we do, and there are Episcopal Benedictine communities in this country and in Canada and in the UK and in South Africa and a bunch of other places. Anywhere really where the Anglican Church has a large footprint, large being relative, of course. If you walked in, if you didn't see the sign, in fact, on our sign, we don't say Episcopal at all, but if you walked into our monastery and you knew we're Catholic Benedictine monastery, you wouldn't think there was any difference, because there is virtually no difference. We both follow the rule of St. Benedict, which was written about 1500 years ago, and we live that out completely. So though our priests can get married, whereas Roman Catholic priests cannot, monks are monks, so we're all celibate, and we don't own personal property. Everything we do is communal in nature, and so we share our food and our house and our whatever we need to live in order to live more deeply into this life. Okay. So that's sort of the first thing that doesn't always ring true. My particular path was I was raised Roman Catholic, and was through sort of the Catholic school system and all of that. And it was sisters who had a huge impact on my life in a really great way. And in particular in high school, Sisters of Mercy, who were like the greatest women I had ever known as a group of people. And they, I was able to express in my high school years this desire I had for prayer and for service to the poor. It turns out that's what they're all about. And so they took me under their wing, and they taught all of us, but they took me in particular under their wing and taught me a lot of the basic things that we do every day. So that had a really big impact on my life. I went to a Roman Catholic community when I was 19 years old and was in it for 2 years. But at the same time, I was coming out and beginning to learn that I was gay, but I had had no experience with that. And a priest of that order said to me, look, I think you have a real call to religious life, but I think you got to go figure this out, or you're going to make a terrible monk. Right? You have to be integrated and understand every aspect of your life. And it's not that at 19 or 25 or 55 or 60 or whatever, you're going to understand that every aspect of your life, but you have to have a sort of a path, a direction. So I left, and he said, I think you're going to be back in 2 or 3 years, but we'll see. I left, and 20 years later, after having a long theater and television career, I had become Episcopalian in the middle of all this time. I discovered the Order of the Holy Cross, which is a Benedictine community of Episcopal monks in West Park, New York, which is in the Hudson Valley. And really, that, like, I knew it instantly as soon as I was there. And I want to talk about that piece of it for a minute, because when I say I knew I was supposed to be a monk right away, I mean right away. My parish went up on a retreat. I did what I always do when I go to a retreat house. I put my bag in my room. I checked in, put my bag in the room, walked to the chapel to say a little prayer like, I'm here, God, you know. And I walked into the chapel, it was completely empty, hadn't met a monk yet, nothing like that. And I just said, this is it. I just knew it. And I knew it because I had already been living a contemplative life. Now, I hadn't been living it as much as I live it now, but I really prayed every day. And every day, part of my prayer life was centered in prayer. And I'll come to talk about that. You've heard Thomas Keating mentioned several times, Basil Pennington, who was another real leader in that movement and worked with Thomas a lot, was my teacher back when I was real young. And so what am I talking about, this monastic contemplative tradition? Well, it's a tradition that comes out of the desert, right? And the Christian tradition of monasticism owes all of its debt to the desert, even though most of it has been lived out in other places that isn't desert. But it instilled in us a desire for interior silence and solitude. There's something about being in a desert which has, danger all around, right? There's, snakes and spiders and, in the time of the desert fathers and mothers, lions in the desert still, and all kinds of animals, the extremes of the heat and the cold with very little protection from it, the lack of food readily available, all of the lack of water readily available. So there's all of these things that make for extreme danger all around you all the time. It's not just like occasionally. And yet these men and women who are responding to the first crisis in the church. And what I mean by that is you have this period of time from after Jesus's resurrection and ascension into heaven and all of that, where what's called the Apostolic Church is founded. And the Apostolic Church starts spreading throughout the Mediterranean basin. Right? And it's met by a considerable amount of martyrdom. People are being martyred for their faith, and they're not worshiping the pagan gods anymore, and they're being used as political pawns, and there's all these things going on. And then what happens in 313 AD is the Emperor Constantine issues the Edict of Toleration, which says that, okay, Christians can be accepted. We're not going to persecute them anymore. We're not going to martyr them. They can have jobs. They can work in the Roman government. And a few years later, in 325, Constantine says, not only are we going to tolerate them, but we're going to make them the official religion of the empire. And that's what causes the first crisis in the church. And up until that point, you have nearly 300 years of people, you really got to want to be a Christian. If it's illegal to be one, you can't get a job, you might be martyred, imprisoned, tortured, right? You really got to want to do that. And so lots of people who are just kind of like the people who show up and say, oh, sure, I'm a Christian, they don't really show up so much. It's really people who are dedicated. The minute you make it the religion of an empire, the minute you have dramatic trouble because the church starts selling itself out. Okay? We're going to give you these, if you go to Rome, and everyone should, and it doesn't matter whether you're Catholic or not, you should go to Rome to understand what starts to happen there. We're going to give you these great temples, make them Christian temples, right? But the government asks, if the government gives you something, the government asks for something back. Okay. And so what happens is that Christianity starts to sell its soul. Right? They think they're doing good. Who doesn't want to not be martyred? Right? That's a very legitimate thing to not want to have happen, right? I know. I don't want to be martyred. Right? It's a legitimate thing to want your people to be safe, right? To have access to whatever that society can provide. Right? but you exchange things. And so what happens is there are men and women in the major cities of the Roman Empire, and in particular in Alexandria, who say, wait a minute, this is not what we're supposed to be. And this idea of white martyrdom develops, where people are going to give up everything and go live in this very dangerous extreme of the desert and not actually get executed. So the like no blood, red blood, right? But as close to martyrdom as you might get. And what they discover out there in the desert is, I think, what Elijah is talking about. Let me just read this. This comes from, I didn't write it out. Comes from, I can tell you the story, I know it well enough. Comes from 1 Kings in the Hebrew scriptures. And that story of Elijah where, you know, he's slayed all the false prophets and now he's run away and he's starving and doesn't, and God somehow tells him, go to sleep and when, you know, get a nap. And when he wakes up, he gets this bread for him to eat. And then he goes up to the cave because he really wants to know God's voice. And Elijah expects God's voice to be in the wind. And then the wind comes and there's no God's voice. And then he expects to be in fire and there's no voice in the fire. And earthquake, no voice in an earthquake. And then the sound of silence descends. And that's where he hears God's voice in total silence. Okay? And it's in fact the only way he can hear God's voice is to have, first of all, exterior silence around him, which enables him to get interior silence, to throw out all the worry and concern for his life. He's perhaps going to be martyred himself, and for all of the political upheaval in Israel at the time. And he can experience what it means to live in God's world and not his own. And that's what our ancestors, the desert fathers and mothers, come to understand themselves. And then they take it one step further, and they take it to the point where they say, you know what, we need to do this together. We need to do this in a community. First of all, you cannot be a Christian on your own. There's no such thing as a solitary Christian, not even a hermit. A hermit is attached to a monastic community. They are still under obedience to that abbot. They still check in, right? They definitely live much more separately and all the rest of it. But you cannot behave as a Christian alone. You have to do that in community. Okay? That's what Christ calls people into. If you look at the flow of the Gospels, any one of them, Christ calls the 12 apostles, Christ calls 72 disciples, Christ brings together 5,000 people to feed, right? It's a continually growing community that Christ is inviting people into. Okay? And all of those people together are meant to have periods of real interior silence. Okay, so next. So what that's all about is finding a path toward God that enables us on our own, individually, to first experience the voice of God and then to understand its meaning in a wider community. Okay, so in the Christian tradition, and in particular in the Roman Catholic tradition, the Orthodox tradition, the Episcopal or Anglican tradition, liturgy is incredibly important, right? And that's true of the Lutherans, there's a whole bunch of people, and it's important to virtually every form of Christianity and very important to certain ones. And there's lots of words and there's lots of, costumes and smoke and candles and all kind of stuff, every bit of which I love, right? So it's not like I don't like that stuff. But that only gets you so far. And it only gets to tell you so much about what it means to live in God's presence, to really understand what Jesus meant when he said, where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there I am also. Okay. So that interior silence is a kind of pathway that's going to get you there. Now, why is this important? I think Thomas Merton put the best words to why this is important. So Thomas Merton was a Trappist monk. Most of you probably have read some of his stuff at Gethsemane Abbey in Kentucky. And he died prematurely in 1968. I still contend the CIA killed him, but that's my own little aside, because he came out against the war in Vietnam. Anyway, the Merton is one of the best communicators about the contemplative life. And just to understand, the Benedictine family is larger than Benedictines, right? It's people who call themselves Benedictines or Trappists or Cistercians or Camaldolese. Any of those monks, we all follow the rule of Benedict. And that's both male and females. And there's versions of all of us on all the inhabited continents of the earth. And there are a lot of Roman Catholic Benedictines, a fair number of Anglican, and 1 or 2 Lutheran communities. But what Merton said, this was back in 1958, is this. This comes out of Thoughts in Solitude. When society is made up of men who know no interior solitude, it can no longer be held together by love. And consequently, it is held together by a violent and abusive authority. Let me repeat that. When society is made up of men who know no interior solitude, it can no longer be held together by love. And consequently, it's held together by a violent and abusive authority. Now, what is he reacting to in 1958, right? The Roman Church had their leadership, as well as their important people who commented on things, like Merton, are deeply concerned about the Soviet Union and communism behind the Eastern Bloc, where everything is pushed towards communitarianism, right? That everything is about the state, the worship of the state, right? And all your work and all of your personal life, and no matter what, it all is meant to go towards the state, right? So on the first level, he's reacting to that, right? And he's trying to say, we got to make sure we're guarding against that. But on the other hand, he's also reacting, and he lays that out later in this book and others, to our countries and any other countries' use or potential use of nuclear weapons. That if you cannot allow for people to have a life that is quiet, that is allows for some introspection, some rest time, some Sabbath time in biblical language, right? That what you get is a mass of people who can be completely controlled by any form of government. Okay. So there's this incredible insight that he has, right? And he goes on and on about the negative power of technology and of industry on human beings. When you think about it, he knows nothing. He's dead in 68. He knows nothing about this stuff, right? Everything that comes out of, all of that, right? And look at how in just the last few years, it has accelerated to play down any of the benefits of electronic media and all these other things, and play up all the bad side of it, the dangerous side of it, right? So it's again the ability to step away and to have time to actually think, what do I think about anything in particular? How do I feel about that? how does that relate to God? What is my relationship with God and with other people and that sort of thing? Okay. So let me stop there and see what questions you have right now.
Any questions online either? You're welcome to type them in the chat.
I guess I have a question. So Thomas Merton basically saying you need that silence, otherwise you don't have true love or true community. It's just
That you cannot know love if you do not have some interior silence and solitude. So this is the book is entitled Thoughts in Solitude. It's one of his least famous, part of me thinks it's one of his best. I've like, there are so many, markings and this and that on it. What he's saying is, without that, he understands that there's a deep need for people to be able to have time to think, right? For you to use a colloquial. I just need a little time to think, get myself together. Just on that level, just on the, what do I think, right? To say nothing of what might God's voice say. And it goes back to Elijah. In all of the, compare those things, and the wind and the fire and the earthquake to, the latest thing that comes up on social media and the latest craziness in the news and the, ridiculous statements by ridiculous politicians and all that. When people are looking for that to be have something to do with God, right? And that's not it. The wind, the fire, the earthquake, none of that does it, right? It's the quiet of God, right? It's that time of surrender to, I am going to stop thinking. First, I'm going to think about what do I actually think or feel. Then I'm going to let go of that. Right? And that ability to let go is the ability that we always as human beings struggle with, and that it's particularly difficult to do today because we have all the same obstacles that people have had throughout human history, all the stuff that goes on in our head, right? All the outside noise, right? But we also have constant chatter. We can't get away from it, right? In terms of the internet and the television and the radio and the cell phones, and like it goes on and on and on and on. And it's, you never get to say enough. Give me a moment to think. I remember my last, real job before I became a monk. The email started to be a major thing at work. And people would type me emails and would call me before I could finish reading the email. Did you get my email? And it was then that I thought, this is going to lead to trouble. Right? I mean, yeah, give me a chance, right? But the important thing about it is to be able to step back and to be able to listen for God, right? So that's what we talk about in the Christian tradition, listening for God. And we talk about that in particular in the Western church. In the Eastern church, they talk about it more likely with the phrase looking for God, right? Which is why icons are so important in their contemplative tradition, right? They want to look through the eyes of Jesus or of the saint or whatever in the icon, and they can see beyond the wood it's painted on and the paint itself and the image itself. They can see beyond into God, right? That's how Orthodox Christianity grew up with the looking for God. In the West, we talked about it more as listening for God. But even the listening, right? And that, I think, is the West's obsession with words. We want to define everything, right? And there's lots and lots and lots of great things that happen because we define something, or because we help explain what a phenomena is or whatever, right? But one of the things to really think about is ultimately the contemplative gets to a point where they don't need to live in that place of definition. They can simply live in the presence of pure love. Okay. And anyone can do that. It takes a practice. It just does, this doesn't happen, right? It takes a practice. But this is the part of the contemplative life that as I grew over the years in it, and I deepened my own practice, I realized that there was this incredible thing that linked all of the major religions of the world, right? Whether it was Native American spirituality, whether it was Buddhism, whether it was Judaism or Islam or Hindu, right? I would talk to people, be friends with people, go visit shrines, whatever, of these different faith traditions, except really the Hindu, I should be clear on that. I've not gotten to meet too much of that, but all those others. And there are different ways of practicing it. There's sometimes different vocabulary and things like that, right? But the contemplative tradition of each of those faiths lead you really to one place, which is learning to live in the presence of love and nonviolence and of healing. And it seems to me that at any time in human history, that would be valuable to know. And including and perhaps especially in our own time. I see a few impacts here, right? With the increased dialogue. Like when Jordan told me about that this group existed, right? Yeah, I was really excited about it. And this is not a place where you normally think that people would talk to each other. I didn't even think, well, really, are there other people who aren't Christian, in a place like Wyoming? I certainly didn't think that in Nebraska, and found all kinds of people around me right away as soon as I moved there. My point is that at any time, learning to live nonviolently with each other as individuals, within our homes, within our neighborhoods, within our country, within the community of nations all around the world, learning to live nonviolently with each other should be a goal of any faithful follower of God, whatever you call God. Right? Learning to live that way nonviolently, where we do not want to bring harm to the other, where we will get to the point where we'll work peacefully and proactively for justice. Right? Add on top of that the crisis in the climate. And it seems to me that people united around the world in a contemplative practice can really help to heal the earth and can help to change people's hearts who need to be part of the healing of the creation. This is not something that God dangles down, oh, okay, you've been sorry enough. I'm gonna, this is up to us to do. And we're either gonna do it or we're not, and we'll suffer the consequences if we don't. So it seems to me like the future of religion is a contemplative path, and it's a way, and that future, I've been around long enough doing this that I don't think it's the day after tomorrow. I think that it is perhaps way, way past our lifetimes, but that in all of the faith traditions that I'm aware of, passing on that faith tradition is actually really important. And finding ways to keep it alive and to let it grow and to let it blossom feels to me like that's the work that we have to do. And that's why I'm willing to go wherever anyone will have me, and we'll go talk about stuff, whatever. So let me stop again. How we do time?
We get about 21 minutes.
Okay.
So we can for some questions.
So how about we do that? How about we do a little bit dialogue and questions and see, and it can be about anything I've talked about, or monasticism in general, or contemplative prayer.
It's my thought that our society is facing the same problems that society faced in the 1500s when the transition from the Middle Ages to modern capitalism was around. You know, there were some pretty bad things that happened in the 1500s. The peasant revolts in 1525, and the 100 Years' War. If you were around at that time, you would have no concept of what capitalism would be, what the economy would be as a result of the changes that happened, let's say between 1500 and 1800. And what we're facing now is the fact that capitalism is collapsing. The whole idea of infinite growth of an economy cannot work. And we see that because of all sorts of things. But the thing that's driving capitalism is materialism. The thing that's going to break materialism is exactly what you said, a spiritual view of humans and the world around us. And that's where the battle lies today.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's an enormous amount of danger with that, right? And essentially, monastics are, Christian socialists. I don't mean that by like the political parties in Europe. I mean, but we share everything, and we try to live as simple a life as possible. And Benedictines don't. In the Roman Church, they do originally, and in the Episcopal Church, we don't. We don't take a vow of poverty. Right? That's not what Benedict's put in the rule. Benedict expects us to live a simple life, and expects us, more importantly, to share everything. Right. So the way we live out that contemplative vision in action is the hospitality piece of Benedictines, right? So people think that sometimes that, oh, the guest house, that's about hospitality and we do the rest of our things. Hospitality isn't our ministry. It's a way of being, right? It's a way of being open to all of God's people, whoever they are. And they can share your faith 100%. They can be completely disinterested in it. They could be opposed to it, right? You welcome people no matter who they are, right? And Benedict tells us in the rule that we're to thank God when we hear the knock on the door. We're to thank God because a poor person has come and needs help, or somebody needs help for some other reason, right? So just the other day, last week, Thursday, once a month, we have a completely silent day in the monastery, and we withdraw from other kinds of works and things like that. And I'm having a great day. It's going beautifully. I love it. And sure enough, around 2 o'clock, bang, 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 knock on the door. I'm like, really, Lord, did I get into it? You couldn't just let me, right? And as I'm walking to the door, I'm thinking, wait a minute, what does the rule tell me? The rule tells me to thank God. And sure enough, it was one of our homeless friends who oftentimes comes to us and needed help again. So it took 20 minutes to, out of my silent day, and didn't do anything to interrupt the beauty of that day, right? It was, in fact, my ability to be with her and to be there, honestly, generously with her, right? Helped to, was a fruit of what the morning had led up to, right? And I could go right back into it. What I was afraid of is he was going to throw me out of the mode, right? So that's one of the, and with the potential between the climate and the potential destruction of the democracy in this country, with the capitalism falling apart, we may be in for a real roller coaster here. And it's happening already. It may get worse. It could get worse as early as the day after election day, right? Who knows? And, we have to really decide how do we want to live like this, right? There are huge political and economic decisions we can make as individuals and as communities of people, But ultimately, if we're not living in the presence of the living God, and if we're not entering more deeply and more deeply and more deeply into that living presence, that healing presence, that forgiving presence, that presence of total love, right? We're going to turn into, when Merton goes on after the part I quoted, he goes on to, that humanity will turn into, you know, a putrid, festering putrid. It just goes on and on. It's not, I thought I'm not going to say that, but here I am saying it. So this is important, right? In little rural areas, in big cities and suburbs and everywhere in between around the world, it's important. What else? What other kinds of questions?
I think we have a question online. Pamela, did you have a question?
There we go. I did. I wondered, I hear some of the distinctions between Episcopalian Benedictines and Catholic Benedictines, but what made you decide were you raised Episcopalian? Did I hear that? Or
No,
did you
I was
turn
raised Roman
Episcopalian?
Catholic, and loved Catholicism and all everything about that. I was very, very involved in the church, and it came to a point in my life after I came out, and I'm living in New York through the, you know, I'm the exact right age that just as I was coming out, AIDS was hitting the mainstream media, and like people were starting to know that and all that. And in fact, when I told my parents that I was gay, the first thing they said to me was, "You're our son, we love you." The second thing they always said was, "Are you sick?" Like that's what they thought. Sick meaning AIDS. And you know, that's what they were panicked about first, right? So that was the era in which I came out. And through the 80s, still I remained Roman Catholic and a very faithful one. And it just came to a point where I knew my life was headed back to the church, like to really, in terms of, that is a very Catholic thing to say. If you're a monk, you're in the church. You know? But I knew it was headed back that way. It was so I still had stuff to do in the theater, but I knew I could not stand up. I just think the Roman position is completely wrong, and it so went against who I am, because I believe God created me in God's image, and in my case, as a gay man. So it would be lying to go become a Catholic priest or a Catholic monk and hold that view. And the Episcopal Church is as close sort of theologically to Catholicism as any, but most importantly, it had a real Eucharist and a real center, and that to me was essential. So that's what got me to be an Episcopalian. And that took, I will say, that was part of that, right? So in those early years when I was with the Passionists, the Roman Catholic Order, we were about 20 minutes away from Spencer Abbey, St. Joseph's Abbey in Spencer, Massachusetts. And that's originally where Thomas Keating and Basil Pennington and William Menninger all met, and they themselves were working. And when they started the whole Center in Prayer movement about 1970, what was happening was all of these like hippies were showing up. It's beautiful, beautiful monastery grounds. And they were going up there and they're hanging out and, you know, dropping acid and doing whatever they're doing. And this is great. People walking in as I'm talking about dropping acid. Welcome.
We're in the right place.
And you know, they were the abbot, the guest master, and the novice master, who are really the only and people who can talk in the Trappist world to guests. And they would start to talk to these young guys and girls who were hippies and saying, "What are you doing?" And they found out that many of them are Catholic or other forms of Christian. And they were just looking for a way to understand the world in a bigger way. And like, what is the divine and where is the divine and all those sorts of things. And they would say to each other, you know, we have this tradition that goes all the way back to the desert that allows you access to the divine in a way that formal ritualistic prayer does not. And that's what they that's how they developed the centered prayer piece. I started being taught by Basil Pennington in 1982. In fact, this month in October, so it's 40 years I've been practicing centered prayer. And I will tell you that more than any other prayer form and more than any other, if you don't know what centering prayer is, it's a Christian form of meditation. And there are a lot of similarities to Buddhist meditation and to mindfulness in the practice, almost exactly the same, right? The difference in centering prayer is that you're centered on your own center, which is Christ, right? The use of that in my life, starting back then in 82, really helped me enormously in navigating the coming out piece, right? So I came from traditional Catholic family, half Irish, half Italian, you know, the whole thing, and in a kind of Catholic ghetto in New York, right? And the problem for me wasn't that there were all kinds of, the priests never talked about that in those days. They never got in the altar on the pulpit and said anything about it. It was just not ever discussed. You never saw gay people in the media. You never read about it. I didn't know anyone, you know, the whole thing. So it's unbelievably disorienting as you enter into puberty and all your friends who are boys are talking about the girls. I'm thinking, I like them, but I don't know what's going on. You know, like, I don't know what's happening here. Right? Very, very disorienting. So there were years in my teens and into my early 20s where I desperately needed something. And I had a prayer from the time I was about 15 years old. And that prayer was, you know, Jesus, please make me the man you want me to be. And what that meant for me at the time was make me straight. And that just wasn't happening. You know, like it just didn't happen at all. And so when I started centering prayer, what I started to hear all around me, not during the actual sit, that's not the point of hearing the voice of God, isn't about when you're doing that centering prayer sit. It's about how you encounter God in the other 23 hours and 40 minutes of the day. Right? And what I kept hearing was, I am making you the man I want you to be. And it was that ability to hear that and to start to integrate that into my life that really is probably the pivotal moment in my life. Because it could have been really bad after that, had I not had a form of Christian meditation. So I was brand new at it. You don't have to have been doing this for 40 years, right? I was brand new at it. Really loved what I heard Basil teach and thought, I'm going to keep trying this. And there was something about him that was so centered and so peaceful that I thought, I want some of that, right? And I would say really it saved my life in a lot of ways, right? So it has been pivotal in my life ever since, but those earliest years, I'll never forget the transformation that could happen because you could be actually loved by God in a way that was theoretical before that to me. It was what we said we did, and the Bible says it, we say it at Mass, and you know, all those other things, but to actually experience it is a different thing. What else?
Yeah, we still have time for a couple more questions.
Oh, you just another road here. So, you know, I think so much of the world, we are worried about the environment. We're heading towards major problems, not just climate change, but all of the ancillary things that come from it, species loss.
Yeah.
And there's just, I don't know, it's all over the place from the soil to everything else. In the morning, I taught him sustainable economics, and part of my homework, because I'm interested, was to analyze everything that's going wrong, and the list is huge and it's daunting and it's terrifying. So the thing that was, there is a question here, but it basically is, you know, I was trying to get my head around this, and I find that what is kind of the loving God Christian perspective response, and I find it well spoken in Franciscans, like the first incarnation of God was the universe in creation. It's not like, oh, I got a pivot point. Life, earth, plants, they're sacred, and they're not just sacred like cool, that's cool sacred. It's like,
Right.
this is God. It's not
Right.
and so, what are your thoughts? I don't know in terms of Benedictine and the kind of perspective on this thing. I mean, what's the paradigm shift that the Christians need to make in terms of seeing nature and God's creation differently instead of like, we're the stewards of creation and we're the bosses and let's just do things our way, with this major deep-seated spiritual shift. And the Benedictines echo kind of the Franciscan perspective, as I understand.
In contemporary times, yes, especially women Benedictines. In the Roman Church, there's a big difference between women who are Benedictine and men. The men tend to be pretty conservative, and the women tend to be quite out there, leading on creation issues and on nonviolence in particular. And we tend to be more like the gals. I would say that the paradigm shift has to begin with the separation of the idea of empire and Christianity. Right. So I started earlier when I was talking about the Roman Empire and all of that. From there, we, historically, in your quick coverage of it all, right, we go to Charlemagne and the Holy Roman Empire, and then we're getting into the British Empire and all of that. The trappings of all of the things that happened with around Queen Elizabeth's death and all that was appalling to me. Like, I thought, are you kidding me that we're still hanging on to the church, still hanging on to it that much, right? And then, of course, American Empire, right? And the Republican Party has done an amazing job since the time of Reagan, basically, starting with Nixon, but really with Reagan, of completely tying the evangelical church to the flag. And we Episcopalians share an issue because, we were, the government, an exile kind of thing all the time, right? We were, we had more presidents than anybody else and more members of Congress and, all the corporations, all that stuff. But what we really have to look at, I think, is if we really think that God is as big as we say God is, right? Whether that's strictly from a Christian point of view or from all faiths involved, right? If we say that, how could we possibly tie it specifically to any country, no matter how much we love that country? I love this country, right? I'm thrilled to be an American, right? But that doesn't mean I think it has any equation with Christianity, right? And, I love baseball. Doesn't mean I think baseball is Christian, right? Like it's crazy to me, right? And that's part of the problem. The church has been, and it's mostly been the movement of religious orders. Now, up until the Reformation, it was first people who did Desert Fathers and Mothers, then it was the Benedictines, right? Then it was the Celtic Church, and it was the Franciscans, right up to the Beguines. These are all religious orders or religious movements that mimic religious life. But the reason they're founded is because they are reforming all the time the fact that the church tied itself to empire somehow. And what it means to tie yourself to empire means you forget the vulnerable. You discard them. So the vulnerable are always the poor, often the sick, right? And since the Reformation, we tied Christianity to empire plus capitalism. And that makes every tree and every ocean and every bit of soil and all the rest a product. And if you treat something like a product,
resource,
right, a resource. And if you treat everything like that, if that's your mindset, then you can have a religious mindset with it. Now that doesn't mean never cut a tree down or never pull some resource out of the ground or out of the water or whatever, right? We're meant to live in community. And part of some of the best insight I've gotten into this, I think, is recently is grading the sweetgrass, right? It's this beautiful book, and the author just won the MacArthur Genius Award, got a bunch of money for it and stuff like that, who is not a woman who's ever wrote a book before, right? She's Native American, and she's a botanist, trained in good schools. She's a professor of botany, and she is Potawatomi Indian, and she is a poet in her tradition and a spiritual leader in her tradition. And she has a way of putting all of this together, right? Where she talks about, anything that a botanist trained in the Western tradition would totally understand and get. And yeah, that's a great way to talk about it. But then teaches how her own people understood this from a kind of natural way all along, and stopped at the abuse part, right? So rather than just taking, there was a combination of giving and taking, right? And seeing trees and bushes and mountains and rivers and lakes and all those things, the way she describes it is that they see it, all those things, as people, that there are souls in there. And that doesn't fit Christian theology well at all, right? But if you think about it, they can't then treat a tree or a lake or a river or a mountain or whatever in a way that is completely abusive, because they see it as a brother or a sister.
Brother, son, sister, moon.
Right? Which goes back to Francis, right?
It seems like in search of something that resonates with the heart, maybe it's also the sense of Christ as healer. You mentioned three things: love, healing, and what's a third?
Non-violence.
Non-violence. And so healing, like healing, Christ is a healer.
Right.
The Comforter, the Holy Spirit is a healer. Something where it just has to be also migrated over to nature as well.
Right.
In the healing of the earth and the loving of something that's no longer a resource, but something to be healed.
Right. And if you
pull
look,
it into the Christian mindset,
right, if you look at the tradition of healing in the Gospels, where Jesus is healing people, he's doing, and then the apostles pick that up in the Acts of the Apostles. He's doing two things, not one. The first thing he's doing is the obvious thing. He's healing the person of leprosy or whatever they have, right? And that's, in and of itself, that would be great, right? But he's actually doing a second, much more what's the word? Like revolutionary thing. He's restoring the person to community. And in doing that, he's restoring the entire community, right? So if you have leprosy, you are pushed off into this place because there are other people afraid of getting it. They're not, the other people aren't even necessarily being cruel. They're just trying to protect themselves and their families and all the rest of it, like back a few years ago, right? Where we had to isolate from each other, right? So there's that. If you, it may be that they were just trying to protect each other. In the case of, Luke does it, in the case of the woman who's bleeding for 12 years, right? Because she's bleeding, she has to be separated from the community. Every woman who menstruated did that for the period that they were menstruating. And then there was a special tent for them and all that, and then they would rejoin the community. Well, here, this poor woman is doing that for 12 years, right? Straight. Has gone to every doctor, Luke tells us, and cannot get cured. And so she throws herself at Jesus, and Jesus heals just by the power of touching his garment. She gets healed. Well, what happens there is she gets restored to her community because she was seen as dirty, and now she's seen as clean. So the healing is both around the physical illness, whatever's going on, and it's about the illness within the community, trying to teach the community, you have to take care of each other. You have to love each other, right? It's a much bigger deal than just getting healed, right? And has resonance down through the years that, everybody dies sooner or later, and people get sick all the time, all that, and all that's bad. But finding ways to always restore the community, always finding ways to connect, is so much of what contemplative prayer is about, right? You can't, if all you're going to do is freak out about COVID, right? you're not going to know how to treat the community. And one of the things I'm most proud of my community is that when COVID started, most of whom were young adults, age 21 to 24 or so. Their immediate response was, what can we do? We live in the poorest neighborhood in Omaha. And they got hit the worst by both the disease and by unemployment. And we started looking around. I said, we're not just going to jump here. We're going to figure out, we're going to pray, and God will give us the answer. And 2 doors down from the monastery is a church that has an outdoor food pantry, 3 shelves. You know, you put a can, you take a can, whatever. And it used, prior to the pandemic, it used to empty about once a week. And not long in, like 2, maybe 3 weeks into it, it started emptying every day. And then I started noticing it was emptying every few hours. So I said, food, that's the thing we can do. When none of us are doctors, we don't have that skill set, right? But we can gather food. We didn't have any money, we didn't have a place to store the food, we didn't have anything. We just started asking people, my bishop and the church, could we use their basement? They weren't using it, you know, because everything was shut down. And we started feeding 400 people every week with a food pantry style thing, right? And that has continued to grow in lots of different ways, which I won't spend the time on now. But I think that's the point, right? If you just jump and say, well, the obvious need is medical, and we can't do anything about the medical, so we're not going to do anything. Right, but community says there's a lot of other things that happen in a crisis like that. Food is one of the big ones, right? The availability of food. And so that's what you do. You don't get there in by running around with your hair on fire. You have hair, you know, right? You do that by reminding yourselves who you are, who you belong to, which is each other and God. And you open yourself up to that quiet and that inner solitude.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I think we'll wrap up for our online folks here, but thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Happy to be
Very
here.
much appreciated. Is there anything else you'd like to?
Just the
Sure.
if you come from a Christian point of view, centering prayer is a really great way to do it. I teach that a lot. There's lots of different ways, workshops, you can learn how to do that and that sort of thing. If you do not come from a Christian tradition, mindfulness or other forms of Buddhist meditation, any of those, it's very available now. And meditation is super important. Okay. And that's it.
All right.
You have a good night. Bye, everybody. See you.
Bye.